Now, I want to move on to look at social identity theory here. Now, if we're matching up our concepts with last week, the ideas that we've just been talking about in relation to the subversion of subcultural style are certainly wrapped up with Marxist ideas and also the reflexive project of the self. So the ways in which people will play with identity in order to challenge dominant meanings. Now, also, we can see elements of the reflexive project of the self in social identity theory, the way people actively engage with consumer items in order to produce or construct an identity. And it's important to remember here that, looking back to our Colgate toothpaste example, we're talking about identities in the plural rather than kind of a unified, coherent identity. We as individuals play a number of different roles in our lives, and as a result of that, we have a number of different identities. So identities are interchangeable. So the identity that you have at work might be very different to the identity that you have when you come to uni, very different to the identity that you have when you go out with your friends, or that you have in your family. So we can adopt various identity positions. That doesn't mean that quite often are contradictory. Now, that doesn't mean any one of them is more correct than another, or that we're living a lie. Rather, what it means is that the way in which we use consumer culture and popular culture is a very flexible process. And it's one that people use to empower themselves. Now, self-identity theory, social identity theory, argues that self-identity is defined by our perception of ourselves and the combination of traits that go to form the perception of ourselves, in addition to our membership of various social groups. So social group membership and shared categorizations form the basis of perceptions, attitudes, beliefs, and values. So we behave in a particular way, in a particular circumstance, in order to create a shared identity with other people. And central to that process is the idea of creating an identity through the membership of in-groups, which are contrasted with out-groups. So in-groups and out-groups are very, very important here in relation to social identity theory. And one of the classic examples of consumer culture, in popular culture, of social identity theory in action and the way we create in-groups and out-groups is through sports fandom. So stop your podcast and me prattling on and click on this link to have a look at the 2014 NRL membership drive ad. So this is an advertisement encouraging people to become a member of their favorite NRL rugby league team. And I thought this was a really, really powerful example of the way advertising attempts to sell a product through using shared identity or creating a sense of shared identity amongst various groups. I think that's really this is a really excellent example of that. So have a look and then rejoin our podcast. Now, Sports fandom is a really classic example of a social identity theory in action. And one of the reasons why it is so classic and dramatic is because it involves uniforms, it involves team colors, and when you support your favorite team, you wear their colors. And of course, sports merchandise is a massive consumer industry, and it's quite a dramatic display, as we can see here. So on our left, we've got some Manchester City and Manchester United soccer fans, and if you support Manchester United, you sit in one section. If you support Man City, you sit in another. And that passion, that identity amongst sports fans, particularly the English Premier League fans, soccer fans in the UK, are a classic example. Sometimes the identity and the creation of in-groups and out-groups gets so strong and is so powerful that police are required to step in and separate the two. So we get very passionate about our membership of various social groups, and we quite often express that passionate membership through using consumer products. Here, it's wearing a particular team's colors, but it might be wearing makeup in a particular way, wearing a particular type of clothing, other sorts of clothing, shoes, whatever. So we use these identities to construct a view of ourselves in as positive a light as possible, regardless of our material status. So one of the interesting things is that sports fandom, although there are very clear class divides in types of sport, particularly in Australia, when we look at rugby league and rugby union, where rugby league is considered very much a working class sport, whereas rugby union in Australia is played largely in private schools. That doesn't happen in other countries. Even though there are those kind of class divides, membership of identity groups, we use those to view ourselves in as positive a light as possible, regardless of our material status. And the textbook argues that this represents a form of impression management. So we engage in various strategies and behaviors in order to get other people to view us in a positive light. So we wear clothes, a certain type of clothing, to get other people to view us in a positive light. We drive a particular car to get other people to view us in a positive light. We Instagram our breakfast when we go out for brunch and post it in order to get other people to view us as knowing the coolest and best new places to go to eat. And this identity here is a form of performance. So we're playing roles and always attempting to display the most favorable characteristics we want other people to see in us. So, it's going to be very rare that we'll Instagram a bad meal and post it. We might tell our friends, I'll never eat there, the food there's really terrible, but we never will. But it would be rare to kind of Instagram our food if it was a bad experience. Now, one of the criticisms of social identity theory is that it overemphasizes individual thought processes and neglects the role of history, culture, economics, and politics. So it's just the idea, people will criticize social identity theory as just kind of focusing on the individual rather than considering the broader economic, cultural, and political identities that are created. And I want to explore this notion, the more political dimensions of social identity theory, over the next couple of slides. And this will bring us back to our example of that we've been working with for a couple of weeks in shoots and in review questions, looking at social identity and impression management in relation to our Holden drivers and our BMW drivers, our Holden Ute people and our BMW people. Now, one of the upshots of our discussions of the review activity was the idea that for other Holden drivers, amongst other Holden drivers, Holden Utes are an awesome, classy, sophisticated, brilliant car. It communicates a particular identity which is viewed positively in relation to other identity groups. In the same way, BMW drivers will see their car as being the most awesome, exciting, classy, powerful car. Now, both groups are right because they're constructing their ownership of the particular car to position themselves within an in-group of other Holden Ute drivers or other BMW drivers. And we also, in our review exercise, we saw the establishment of outgroups here as well. So our Holden Ute driver would or might view our Holden Ute driver might view BMW drivers as wankers, and our BMW drivers might view Holden Ute drivers as bogans. And that we acknowledge that in our responses to the review exercises. So we've got in-groups and out-groups being established there in the process of constructing and maintaining an identity, a social identity around the type of car that we drive. Now, I want to explore this idea of bogan and its connection to the sort of ideology of Aussie pride as a way of both demonstrating how an identity which is grounded, quite firmly within working class culture, so quite firmly within kind of lower socioeconomic status, can be used positively to create a positive social identity, to create an in-group, and also how it can be used to establish out-groups as well. So here we have some representations of bogan Aussie pride. We've got our classic Aussie pride tattoos. I thought the two advertising signs here were very interesting. So we've got Aussie Pride concreting, and Aussie Pride truck rim polishing. So very much associating the idea of Aussie Pride with working class, tradie type employment. Now, of course, that in-group has to have an out-group by which it will identify itself against. So here we see this idea of Aussie pride carrying over into quite racist, overtly right-wing ideologies. Now, obviously, that finds political expression in Pauline Hanson's One Nation Party and the emergence of various right-wing groups in Australia. But it also has a very potent expression within consumer culture. So we know that you can buy t-shirts or singlets that both express Aussie pride, but also are very exclusionary to other cultural groups. And we also know the bumper sticker with the Australian flag that says with various levels of profanity. If you don't like it, leave. So we will use forms of popular culture, forms of consumer culture, to send very powerful political messages to outgroups in order to reinforce our own identity within a particular in-group. In last week's podcast, we also talked about the commodification of the self. And I want to explore that idea a little further in relation to the idea of commodified identities and how that operates within consumer culture and the way in which consumer culture offers us a range of packaged identities. So we worked in tutorials with the idea of the Kardashians being famous for being famous. That they're kind of a commodity unto themselves. And that idea of identity being packaged and presented to sell us as individuals is a very powerful one at the moment within consumer culture, within popular culture, particularly around the idea of personal achievement, career achievement, and kind of financial success, but also within the body as well. So reality TV, whether it be The Block, Shark Tank, kind of focusing on, very tangible expressions of wealth, either through, home ownership, home renovation, or entrepreneurship, and then success expressed through losing weight through the body in a show like The Biggest Loser in order to conform to a particular image of success. These are very important and very powerful and significant examples within contemporary popular culture. And marketing and advertising really does teach us to desire success in almost every sphere of our lives. Life is competitive. Life is competitive, and advertising asks us to constantly see how we measure up or whether we measure up against the ideal or the norm. If you want an example of the commodified self in action, I don't think you have to go any further than QUT advertising. Now, I know I'm being recorded here and it's being laid down for all time, but I don't think QUT's ads are necessarily the best part of QUT. And I think the image of higher education and the very highly commodified image of university education that QUT's ads in particular, I'm singling them out, but I'm not saying they're the only university that does this. I think undervalue the importance of going to university and getting a higher education. It's not about simply getting a job. It's about more than that. Going to university is about more than that. And I think QUT ads sell us, both as teachers and you as students, pretty short in that regard. So the top link is to a YouTube ad for QUT, or an ad on YouTube for QUT, a real one, bad pun, I apologize. And the bottom link is a parody ad for QUT. So some very creative, probably some student from the creative industries, a film student, created a parody ad. So have a look at them both and think about the ways in which the official ad sells success as a commodity, and then how the parody ad unpacks that and kind of skewers it, I think, really, really hilariously. So capitalist success in consumer culture and under this idea of the commodified self is associated with a particular set of personality traits. So agility, the ability to change and adapt, entrepreneurship, independence, being really competitive and aggressive, and also being extroverted, being a people person, engaging with people, and winning people over, how to make friends and influence people, that type of thing. And there is, how to make friends and influence people is the name of a classic self-help book, and there is an entire industry once upon a time called self-help, now called personal development, of books, online courses, podcasts, you name it, that are designed to enable you to acquire all of these qualities if you don't have them. So you can become more efficient by reading Tim Ferriss's The 4-Hour Work Week. You can become more effective generally. I don't know necessarily what being effective means, but you can become it if you read the 7 Habits of Highly Effective People. And then we've got entrepreneurship and innovation Bibles written by people, successful entrepreneurs like Richard Branson. So there's an industry which sells solutions to our personal or our perceived personal shortcomings in capitalist society. And in a really fascinating but simultaneously, I think, kind of perverse example of incorporation, we've now got a sub-branch of the personal development industry which celebrates alternative ways of being successful. So, Susan Cain's book, Quiet, The Power of Introverts in a World That Can't Stop Talking, and her website and the courses she offers. If you're not up to being an extrovert, or you don't want to be an extrovert, that's okay. You can buy the book, do the course that will teach you how to celebrate being an introvert. If you get tired of a high-powered, high-pressured entrepreneurial lifestyle, that's okay. You can read Arianna Huffington's book, Thrive, and opt out of that. And the big one at the moment is the ideology, is the cult, if you like, the craze of minimalism. The idea of leading a minimalist lifestyle, owning as little as possible, focusing on experiences rather than things. Minimalism is a very popular form of personal development at the moment. And again, we've had a few assignments focusing on minimalism, and I think it's still a really, really interesting topic because it's kind of achieving mainstream, really mainstream appeal at the moment. If you look at, the home furnishings in places like Target, Big W, Kmart, they're all quite minimalist in focus. So the trend has sort of reached, has really reached the super mainstream, which is quite ironic, of course, because in order to look like you have nothing, or in order to look like you have as little as possible, you've got to go out and buy a whole new set of home furnishings or a whole new set of clothes. So you're actually spending quite a bit of money to look like you don't spend any money at all. And the idea of minimalism, I think, also is just not practical for many people. So, you know, if you're kind of a married couple or a couple with a family, a few kids, both partners working, chances are you're not going to be able to live in a tiny apartment in the inner city. A, because there's not going to be enough space and you'll drive each other insane and the kids will go crazy. And B, you probably can't afford it, particularly Australian real estate prices. So living in the suburbs, in a house with some sort of backyard for the kids to play in and all those sorts of things, a kind of maximalist lifestyle, if you like, is necessary. And then, of course, if you live in the suburbs and you've got to drive to work, you need a car. So this kind of minimalist fantasy of not owning a car becomes not only, you know, just not practical, and doubly so if both partners work and need to drive. So you need to buy a car in order to have a job, in order to maintain your family. So the minimalism is kind of in many respects an elitist fantasy that is just not practical for the vast majority of the population. That doesn't mean that the vast majority of the population is wrong or stupid. Rather, it means that we live a particular way, and within those constraints, people are doing the best that they can. Social media and the commodified self in many respects is a no-brainer. You know, we're all very, very well skilled at constructing the best possible identity on social media, whether it be on Facebook or Instagram or whatever platform you like to use. And the idea of, you know, having the right personality online is absolutely essential to being successful. So whether you want to be an influencer, you know, a social media influencer, or you have the right Tinder profile or the right type of Tinder profile or the right type of RSVP.com profile in order to find a partner, having the right identity, having this most successful identity is essential to living online. And in our tutorials, we'll have a think and a chat about the various ways we sell ourselves on social media, because we all do it. Me as much as anyone, and your tutors as much as anyone as well. We're all implicated in this. So I think it's always very useful and valuable to kind of step back and think about the various ways we sell ourselves. We sell ourselves on social media and put our best foot forward, and the work that goes into doing that. You know, the number of selfies you've got to take in any one sitting before you get the right one to demonstrate to the rest of the world how spontaneous and wild and crazy your life is. There's a lot of effort that goes into that. A really interesting form of the commodified self is motherhood. Motherhood generally, and the category of the yummy mummy, and we've got soccer mums, we've got MILFs, we've got all those categories of motherhood which are commercialized and also have a political significance. They say some very powerful things about what it is to be a mother and what it is to be a woman more generally, and how feminism has grown, adapted, and been mainstreamed to expand the range of identity positions that women can occupy. That doesn't necessarily make them always completely liberating, but again, it doesn't necessarily make us victims of consumer culture either. So in tutorials, we're going to address some of these questions. You can have a look at the two different versions of Yummy Mummy that we've got there, and then think about some of these questions in advance of the tutorial. Motherhood is a category that's very, very powerfully focused through the body, which kind of makes sense really, in that, you know, you've got to have a child to become a mother, so the idea of the body is kind of central there. But the way the body is articulated in a whole range of ways around motherhood and motherhood as an identity is something that I think is really interesting to explore, and we'll do that in tutorials. This idea of the distinctive self and how we develop taste, again, harks back to last week when we were looking at cultural capital and how consumer products are used to communicate cultural capital, and how we use consumer culture to choose the right lifestyle and communicate our participation in that lifestyle as a marker of taste. And just to reinforce this point, that taste is based on our cultural affiliation. Taste is based on our cultural affiliation. So Holden Ute drivers think their car is absolutely the best because it gives them a sense of cultural affiliation, in the same way that BMW drivers think their car is absolutely the best. Now here, class plays increasingly less of a role than the idea of lifestyle, that we adopt a particular lifestyle regardless of our level of income to communicate how we want the world to see us. And that's a really important point. So lifestyle becomes more important here than social class, because we use lifestyle to communicate our identity. An everyday, a really common and everyday example of how we might do this is through coffee. Australia in particular is one of the biggest coffee drinking countries in the world, thanks to our European multicultural heritage. The Greeks, the Italians, the Turks, and all of those cultures which brought variations of coffee from Europe in those waves of migration from the post World War II. We are an enormous nation of coffee drinkers. We also have one of the highest proportions of individual, independent cafes in the world. We know that Starbucks never really caught on here. Starbucks never really caught on in Australia in the way that, you know, it is the dominant form of coffee in the United States, and certainly perhaps in various parts of Asia as well. So coffee culture in Australia is quite interesting. Again, thinking about assignment topics, coffee culture and the way coffee culture develops and evolves is certainly a really interesting topic. But let's have a look at two different forms of espresso coffee. So here we have an ad for the Hungry Jack's Wrap and Cap combo. So Hungry Jack's selling 100% Arabica bean coffee with its breakfast wrap. Have a look at the ad on the link there and think about the question of posing for you here. So in addition to being a cheap and convenient breakfast, what forms of cultural capital are being sold in our ad for the Hungry Jack's Wrap and Cap? Go and have a look at that ad and make some notes about the types of cultural capital that are being sold in that ad. Similarly, I'd like you to do the same for this Nespresso ad. So how does this version of espresso coffee in this Nespresso ad, which you can get by following the link once again, how does that version of espresso coffee differ from the version offered by Hungry Jack's? So again, go and have a look at this ad and make some notes, compare it to the Hungry Jack's ad. How is it different? How is it different? How is the version of espresso coffee advertised by Nespresso? How is it different to the version offered by Hungry Jack's? And finally, I want to bring us back to gender and feminism and explore in more detail the gendered self. And gender is an absolutely, central and fascinating part of consumer culture. So we made the point in the first lecture that consumption is a heavily gendered category. It's a category that's traditionally been gendered feminine. And consumer culture, through advertising, largely, has tended to reproduce two forms of femininity. So a version of femininity that conforms to the ideal of the domestic servant, the housewife, and also a version of femininity based around the liberated, empowered woman. And a watershed moment within popular culture for how those kind of two contradictory positions clash and get negotiated by women in their everyday lives was Sex in the City. This was a really, really big moment for contemporary versions, contemporary representations of feminism, how feminism got discussed, femininity got discussed in everyday life. And it's left a really significant legacy in other television programs such as Girls, the short-lived, I think sadly, short-lived Girl Boss. But it's left a really big legacy, regardless of what you think of the show. And I know that based on some of your tutorial activities, some of you are still watching it. Still watching Sex in the City, whether it be on Foxtel, it's on 11, or DVD, or streaming. And if you want to get a sense of how a show like Sex in the City explores the notion of the gendered self, go to this YouTube clip that I've got a link for you there. I think the title says it all. It's Samantha Jones getting very angry at her boyfriend, Smith, her much younger boyfriend, Smith, and the fight that follows. So have a look at that, because I think that clip really nicely encapsulates that tension between the woman as domestic servant and woman as liberated individual. And that's been a major kind of transition in advertising. So here on the left, we've got an ad for lingerie for bras, which is specifically and explicitly states that if you wear the right bra, you're going to get the right man. You'll trap the right man if you wear the right form of lingerie. Whereas the ad on the left is far more ambiguous. It's far more ambiguous. It's still about getting some form of satisfaction, and one of those forms of satisfaction is potentially associated with getting a romantic partner and sex, but it's left a little bit open. There's no man here. There's no man here. It's only a woman, even though the slogan is invest in love. Is it loving another person, presumably a male, or is it loving yourself? So if you have a look on QUT readings at some of the research that's been done on lingerie, a lot of the findings focus on the fact that women buy lingerie in order to please themselves rather than please a man, to feel good about themselves. And, you know, a number of you are probably going to be able to identify with that also. So there's been, you know, I think this is quite a dramatic representation of the sort of shift in advertising culture historically when it comes to looking and viewing women as consumers. The ad on the left is focused around getting a man, whereas the ad on the right is much more ambivalent, ambiguous about whether you buy lingerie to please a man or to please yourself. Again, we can see that represented in this ad here. This ad plays with that idea of wearing lingerie to please yourself or to get a man, even more kind of overtly. So here we have, you know, a woman playing with, I'm pretty sure it's a remote control. So for a remote control car, or maybe a video game, I think it's a remote control car. And the slogan here is "Make him your toy." So there's kind of an explicit objectifying of the male here, who is absent, interestingly enough. You know, this ad is about female sexual empowerment, turning men into sex objects, but the man is completely absent here. It is still the woman appearing in the photo in lingerie, and quite an explicit pose as well. Quite an explicit pose. So there are some contradictions here. And feminism and femininity within consumer culture, if you're thinking about question 3 in particular, but if you're addressing other elements of gender in your first assignment, embrace that contradiction, because that's how women live their lives within contemporary consumer culture. And again, that. Those of you who are women know that all too well, so don't be afraid to draw on that contradiction. This is a topic that we will discuss in tutorials, and I want you to have a bit of a think about it beforehand. Burlesque culture, whether through fashion stores like Kitten d'Amour, contests such as Miss Burlesque Australia, or even there's just a number of kind of burlesque dancing, burlesque performance courses that women can do as a way of self-expression or learning a new hobby. Burlesque culture is quite popular in contemporary Australia. And what I'd like you to think about is whether the popularity of burlesque culture represents a form of female empowerment, because the clothing is overtly, perhaps not sexual, but sensual overall. I mean, it does embrace lingerie quite a lot. The corset is worn as both a piece of underwear and also as an outer garment. It's risque rather than sort of overtly sexual. So it comes from that sort of 1950s pin-up culture. And as a result of its kind of historical origins, it embraces a female body image, which is very different to the kind of very slim images that dominate a lot of advertising. Burlesque culture celebrates voluptuousness, it celebrates curvy women and different forms of the female body. So I want you to have a think, and we'll discuss this in tutorials, whether burlesque culture represents a form of female empowerment, or perhaps how it might be seen to represent a form of female empowerment. And that's where I want to wrap up this podcast and remind us that identity in relation to consumer culture is not a unified concept. Our identity within consumer culture is inherently contradictory, and a good analysis, a good understanding of our identity within consumer culture will embrace that contradiction, will explore the range of possibilities that are available in relation to identity construction within consumer culture. And because identity construction is contradictory, it means that our project of constructing, developing, and maintaining identities is ongoing. It's ongoing, and it's simultaneously empowering and disempowering. Identity is an ongoing project, and it's simultaneously empowering and disempowering. And in order to fully understand how all of that works, we need to stop and step back and consider the cultural, economic, and political context in which consumer culture operates. And that's why in the first assignment, we ask you in all three questions to think about the history of the consumer item that you are analyzing, or the consumer group, or whatever it is that you are analyzing. So what is the history of the thing you're analyzing? How we think about it changed over time? Has our thinking about a particular consumer product or a particular consumer group changed over time? So history and context plays a very important role in our understanding of identity. So thank you very much. I really enjoyed doing this podcast. This is a really fun podcast for me to do. We cover a lot of territory and a lot of ground, and I think we deal with some really fascinating ideas that you're going to get to work with and explore in tutorials. So thanks very much for listening, and we'll see you in class.